betrayed my boyfriend on our couples trip, and his revenge was worse than I imagined. My relationship with Damon wasn't perfect, but for a long time, it was good. We had our fair share of issues, like every other couple, but there was one problem that always found its way back into every argument and every moment that could have been peaceful, but wasn't. And that was work. When we first met, I didn't have a job. I was between things and trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Damon, on the other hand, was already deep into his career as a financial analyst. Back then, I used to joke that I was sharing him with another woman, the woman being his job, but in reality, it wasn't really a joke, though. Work had him wrapped around its finger. He'd stay late at the office, come home only to crack open his laptop again, and when we were together, it always felt like he was practically counting down the seconds until he had to go back to work. It didn't matter if it was a weekday or a weekend, a holiday or my birthday. There was just always something urgent demanding his attention. I tried to make him see it and to make him understand that he didn't have to be constantly switched on and so uptight. I tried to teach him that it was okay to take a break and let things wait until tomorrow. But every time I brought it up, he'd give me the same long-winded explanation about how important his work was and how much responsibility he had. He would tell me that I just didn't get it and that people depended on him. So after a while, I stopped trying. It was exhausting being the only one who wanted more for us. You're probably wondering why I stayed and kept dating someone so consumed by their job that they barely noticed the person sitting across from them. And the answer is simple. When Damon wasn't drowning in work, which I admit wasn't very often, he was wonderful. He was thoughtful in the smallest ways. He knew how I liked my coffee. He gave massages. He would leave notes for me before work. And he was also just a genuinely nice guy. He was nothing like some of my asshole exes. Damon was kind. He checked every box I thought mattered. The only flaw, really, was how much of his life and our life was consumed by work. So I told myself that wasn't enough reason to throw away a good relationship. I convinced myself that I could handle it and that I could make him see reason if I just tried hard enough. And for a while, it even worked. Whenever I reached my breaking point and told him how lonely it felt to be with someone who was never really there, he'd soften up and he'd change. He'd shut the laptop and give me all his attention, like I was the only thing that mattered. Those moments made me feel seen again, and they made me believe that maybe we'd get through it. But it never lasted. Eventually, he'd drift back to his desk and back to the endless spreadsheets and emails, and I'd be left alone and missing him again. Years passed, and not much changed. If anything, it even got worse. Because Damon eventually became chief financial officer, and that promotion came with even more demands. There were longer nights, more meetings, and even less of us. My only saving grace was that I got my own job. I had been working as a social media manager. It was remote, which sounded nice in theory, but in practice, it wasn't great constantly being in an empty apartment. The only good part was that the stress kept me distracted. At least it used to. I really thought I could handle it. I told myself that love required patience and that every relationship had its rough patches, that maybe this was just ours. But I was just fooling myself. The resentment and frustration was bubbling under the surface for months, until I felt like I was practically in a relationship with myself. We never did the things we used to anymore. Damon would just come home, drop a distracted kiss on my forehead, and go straight to the second bedroom we'd converted into his office. That was that. Nothing else. It wasn't what I signed up for, not even close. And deep down, I knew it wouldn't be long before I hit my limit. So, unsurprisingly, it all went to shit a few weeks ago. That point wasn't where anything actually happened, not technically. It was just the catalyst, the thing that set everything else in motion. Maybe if it had never happened, I wouldn't be where I am now. But there's no point in wondering about that anymore because it's already happened, and it all started with a fight. Now, Damon and I were no strangers to arguing. We'd been together long enough to know exactly how to hit each other where it hurt. We'd argue until our voices were strained, and it usually went the same way. He'd tell me he was doing his best, that I was asking for too much, and I didn't understand the pressure he was under. I'd tell him that if this was his best, I'd hate to see what it looked like when he wasn't even trying. Something along those lines. It was this constant repeating cycle, and by the end of each one, he'd swear he'd change, and for a few days, he actually would. He'd make dinner, take me out, and pay attention to me. But it never lasted. Like a few days or a week later, he'd be back to his usual routine. But this fight was different. That night, when he walked through the door, I didn't wait for him to disappear into the study like he always did. Before he could even set his keys down, I grabbed his laptop bag and put it on the table. "We need to talk," I told him, and I was surprised my voice was steadier than I felt. He looked tired, disinterested even, but I didn't care. I told him that I couldn't handle it anymore, and that I didn't even recognize what my life had become. I said it quietly at first, but when he laughed, when that condescending sound left his mouth, I got angry. "Oh my God, you're being so dramatic," he said in his typical dismissive tone. That's what he always said when I tried to talk about my feelings, like emotion was an overreaction, and like the loneliness I felt was just me being unreasonable. I told him he had no idea what it was like to spend all day alone in an apartment that was supposed to feel shared, but didn't. He shrugged and said it wasn't like the apartment was a prison, that I could go out whenever I wanted if I felt that suffocated. That comment made me want to throw his damn laptop across the room. It was such a him thing to say, rational to the point of being cold and practical to a fault. He had this habit of dissecting every emotional problem until it no longer had any feeling left in it. I told him countless times that practicality had no place in certain conversations, and that it wasn't about the logic of what I could do, but about what I wanted to do. And what I wanted was to spend time with him and do things together like we used to. I wanted to feel like we were partners and not roommates. I told him all of that, and for the few seconds where he actually went quiet, I thought maybe something had finally sunk in. But then I kept talking because I'd held it in too long, and I told him I wasn't sure how much longer I could take it. I said I was exhausted from being the only one trying. That word exhausted set him off. I knew I'd made a mistake when he frowned and immediately went on the defensive. He started talking over me and ranting about how he was the one who was exhausted. Never mind the fact that I wasn't his boss, and his exhaustion from work had nothing to do with me. He told me I had no idea what it was like to shoulder his kind of stress. And then he flew into his usual self-important speech, and how he didn't have the luxury of shutting off like I did. I didn't let him finish, though. I told him I didn't care and that I was sick of feeling like second place to his work. "Wow," I said after a while of us telling back and forth. "I can't believe you actually had the audacity to bring up marriage a few days ago when this," I gestured between us, my voice getting louder and louder, "this miserable pattern is what our lives would look like." Damon's brows furrowed. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that nothing would change," I snapped. "Even if we got married, you'd still spend all your time ignoring me. The only difference is you'd be doing it with a ring on your finger." The words hit him hard. I could see it in the way his jaw clenched and the way he frowned. Something twisted in my chest, but I didn't take it back. I turned away and headed for the bedroom. "You can sleep in the study tonight," I remember saying over my shoulder. "You love being in there so much, you might as well stay." Then I closed the door before he could say another word. It was harsh, cruel even, but in that moment I didn't care. I was too angry, too drained, and too bitter. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I'd ever felt between us. I expected him to come after me that night, to knock on the door like he usually did after our fights, ready to apologize and promise change. But he didn't. Not that night. Not the next day either. This time, Damon didn't grovel. He didn't even bring it up. He went to work, came home, and stayed quiet. It was unsettling, and I didn't know what to make of it. Part of me was relieved. Another part was terrified. I thought maybe that was truly the end of it, and sooner or later he would come to me and say we should break up. 3 days later, I came home from the store with grocery bags in my arms, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Damon was already there. I remember standing in the kitchen for a second, confused. "You're home early," I said. He smiled and told me he wanted us to have dinner together. I didn't know what to say, so I nodded, set the groceries down, and joined him. The dinner felt almost normal. We talked about small things, the food and the neighbors. We avoided bringing up work. It wasn't until after we ate that he finally looked serious again. He said I'd been right about everything, that he had been neglectful and he'd let work come before us. I didn't interrupt. I was only half listening. It was nothing he hadn't said before. I thought it was the same old spiel until he pulled out his phone and slid it across the table toward me. "For what?" I asked without looking at it. "So we can spend more time together," he said. That was when I looked, and what I saw on the screen was an email confirmation for 2 tickets to a week-long couples trip. There was even a full itinerary with spa days, hiking, wine tasting, boat rides, everything really. It looked perfect. For a moment, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that he had actually taken the time to plan something for us. I felt this rush of happiness I hadn't felt in years, and before I could stop myself, I threw my arms around him. He laughed and then hugged me back. He told me things were going to be different from now on, that this trip was just the start. And looking back now, I realize he was right. Things were different from then on, just not in the way I ever could have imagined. I was so excited I could barely sit still on the ride from the airport to the resort. Damon sat beside me, scrolling through his phone, and even though he wasn't saying much, I didn't mind. I told myself that this was a fresh start, and that the trip could be the turning point we'd needed for so long. I thought that maybe things would finally be different. When we got to the resort, the guide greeted us and he gave us a brief rundown of the schedule, explained how the activities worked, and led us through the courtyard before showing us our room. I turned to Damon, who had already started unpacking, and for a second I felt that rush I used to feel when we first started dating. I told him how beautiful the view was, and he agreed, even smiled. But then he pulled out his laptop. I didn't even realize he'd packed it until that moment. I must have made a face or something because he looked up and said that he just needed to finish up a few things. Just a few things. And I believed him. After all, he had already proven he was sorry. He'd arranged the trip and gone through all the effort to plan something for us. I couldn't let my frustration ruin that. So I smiled and told him it was fine and that I'd unpack while he finished. He promised he wouldn't be long. I wanted to believe that too. But only a day into our trip, it became painfully clear that my excitement had been wasted. Finishing a few things turned into more things and then starting others. It was like the same cycle we'd lived through for years had followed us across the ocean and set up camp in our resort room. By the end of that first day, I couldn't pry Damon off the bed or his laptop if I tried. I still did try, though. I begged him to come out with me, to try one of the scheduled activities we'd signed up for together. He agreed eventually, but even then, his mind wasn't there. Every time I tried to talk to him or make things romantic, he'd nod absently or give me half smiles. It all felt so forced, and after that first day, I gave up. I decided I'd just treat the trip as an all-expenses-paid vacation for myself instead of waiting around for him. So the next morning, while Damon stayed buried in spreadsheets, I left. I spent the day walking around the resort, exploring some of the shops, and lounging by the pool with a drink in my hand. For the first time in months, I felt a little bit of peace. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than sitting in a silent room, watching the man I loved pick work over me again. By the time I got back to our suite that evening, I was exhausted, but content. Damon was writing in his journal, and I didn't even bother saying anything. I was about to take a shower and call it a night when there was a knock on the door. It was one of the resort guides. He smiled and told me there was an open slot for the evening couples yoga class. I was about to tell him we'd pass when he added that tonight's session would be done separately, the women with one instructor and the men with another. That detail made me pause. I wasn't interested in any of the bonding experiences anymore after the way Damon had acted, but a session with only women sounded nice after the long day. So I said yes. Damon didn't even look up from his screen when I told him I'd be gone for a bit. I should have just gone to bed. But I didn't. And that's where I met him. He was the first person I saw when I walked in. He was the instructor. He smiled at me, and I have no idea why it made me feel flustered. He was tall, with darker hair, and darker, more defined features than Damon's. Damon always looked clean-cut and perfectly put together, but the man was rugged in a way. He welcomed me and introduced himself as Zane. He asked how I was enjoying the resort so far, and I didn't really know how to answer. It had only been one day, but I already hadn't been having the best time. It felt embarrassing to admit that, though, so I told him it was great. and that I'd spent the day exploring. I thought that would be the end of the small talk, but then he asked why I'd gone alone. I hesitated before lying and saying that my boyfriend had eaten something that didn't agree with him, so he was resting. It wasn't that big of a lie, I told myself. I just didn't want him, or anyone, to know that my boyfriend had chosen to work instead of spend time with me. Zane looked at me like he could almost tell I wasn't being entirely honest, but he didn't push. Instead, he gestured toward the mats and told me to pick one and sit near the front. Then he asked me to tell him about myself. I laughed and asked if that was even allowed, and told him that he should be getting ready for class instead. He gestured around the empty studio, smiled, and said he had some time to kill, and that there was no rules against getting to know the guests. The way he said it made me laugh again, and before I knew it, I was actually talking. There wasn't much to tell. I told him I worked as a social media manager, that it was mostly remote, that I liked to read when I had time. He nodded like everything I said was fascinating. When he talked, he told me about his life before the resort. He was just about to tell me about how he'd ended up there when we heard voices outside. We'd stopped talking when more women began to trickle in. He gave me a small secret smile before greeting them all, telling them to grab mats and settle in. And even as the class went on, that smile lingered in my mind. That night, when I went back to the room, I couldn't stop thinking about him, not even when Damon kissed me and asked about my day. The next morning, Damon had breakfast with me before disappearing back into his work. I didn't even try to hide my disappointment. Instead, I went to the pool because I was determined to enjoy myself. I swam around for a bit before I laid in a lounge chair, scrolling through my phone, wondering if I'd ever see Zane again. I told myself it was just curiosity, but then I heard his voice. I looked up and saw him at the poolside bar, laughing with the bartender. Without even thinking, I was on my feet and walking toward him. He turned, saw me, and smiled like he'd been expecting me. "Is your boyfriend still sick?" he asked teasingly. For a second, I forgot the lie. Then I caught up and said yes, he was. He nodded like he didn't believe me but didn't push. I asked if there were any yoga classes today, and he shook his head. He told me that today was mostly for water activities. Those were actually the things I'd been most excited about when Damon first showed me the itinerary, but standing there next to Zane, I didn't care about them anymore, especially since I'd have been doing them alone if I'd gone. I asked when the next yoga session would be, and he smirked a little and asked if I just wanted to spend more time with him. It was playful and more than inappropriate, but it still made my cheeks warm. I told him that with my boyfriend sick, I didn't have anyone else to talk to, and that I didn't want to do any of the couple's stuff alone. He nodded thoughtfully, said he understood, and I could tell he meant it. Spending your days surrounded by couples probably came with its own kind of loneliness. He said that he had to do a few things, but I was free to tag along, and then he warned me that his life wasn't very interesting. I said I didn't mind. He picked up a package sitting on the counter, nodded for me to follow, and we started walking. As we went, he continued the story he'd started the night before. He talked about how he'd come here on vacation, fallen in love with the place, and decided to stay. He'd quit his job over email, stayed on as a yoga instructor, then started helping out around the resort whenever they needed extra hands. When I asked why he was delivering something, he smiled and said that he wasn't just the yoga teacher, he was also a masseuse, and he delivered things around the resort because it was so big. "Whatever pays the bills," he'd explained. We kept walking and talking, and it felt effortless. He had a dry sense of humor and this easy, unbothered way of speaking that drew me in. He didn't seem to take life so seriously, and I found that comforting, refreshing even. Damon always made everything feel so heavy and urgent, like the world would collapse if he missed an email. Zane was the opposite. He seemed like the kind of man who could just breathe and be okay. I knew it was strange, talking and laughing with a resort worker like that, when technically I should have been spending my time with my boyfriend. But for those few hours, I didn't care. For the first time in a while, I wasn't lonely. And that felt dangerously good. I couldn't find Zane the entire next day, not at the spa or the pool, not even just passing through the resort. It shouldn't have mattered. I told myself that more than once. I was here to relax or to enjoy myself. I had all those amenities to myself, and yet I was busy wondering where he was. It was ridiculous, I knew that. I'd met the man twice. Still, I couldn't shake the way his absence made my day feel dull. So I spent the day drifting. I stopped by shops and restaurants. I bought trinkets I didn't need. I even picked up a few things for Damon, even though he didn't deserve them. I avoided the other couples as much as I could. Watching them made me feel worse. They were everywhere and constantly looking perfect. I knew it wasn't always real. Zane had said something about the day before. But still, seeing them reminded me of everything I didn't have. By the time evening rolled around, I didn't have the energy for the scheduled couples dinner. The thought of sitting there alone while everyone else was coupled up made my stomach turn. So I found a quiet corner in one of the smaller restaurants, ordered something light, and ate alone. When I finished, I drifted to the bar by the pool. I was staring into my glass, feeling a familiar kind of loneliness, when I heard his voice. I looked up, half thinking I was imagining it, but there he was. He looked surprised to see me sitting there, alone again, and luckily, he didn't bring up my boyfriend. He just smiled that gentle smile and asked how I was doing and how I was feeling. Maybe it was the alcohol, but I didn't feel like pretending in that moment. I told him I wasn't doing great and I wasn't having the best time. I said that the trip wasn't what I thought it would be. I didn't go into detail or tell him why, and he didn't push for more information. Instead, he set down the small package he'd come to collect and asked if he could sit with me. I nodded, and he took the stool beside mine. After he ordered a drink and sat with me for a bit, I felt some of the tension in my chest start to fade. We talked for a while, about the resort, about life, about everything, really. He told me stories about some of the more ridiculous guests he'd met over the years, people who'd demanded massages at midnight and couples who'd broken up mid-vacation, things like that. The way he told the stories had me laughing harder than I had in months. By the time we were a few drinks in, my face hurt from smiling. Then he said something that made me pause. He told me that those other women I'd been avoiding weren't as different from me as I thought, and that a lot of them were lonely too. Their husbands went along with what they wanted, but they were never actually present, and that the majority of them actually hated their wives. He said that I was lucky. The reason Damon wasn't spending time with me was just because he was sick. I didn't correct him. I didn't tell him Damon wasn't sick, and that he was just too busy working to notice I existed. I didn't tell him that I was exactly like those women, maybe worse. I just nodded, because what else could I do? Then he leaned in, and the air between us shifted. His hand reached up to tuck a stray strand of hair behind my ear, with a kind of casual intimacy I hadn't felt in so long it startled me. His fingers brushed my skin lightly, and my heart stuttered. He told me, quietly, that he probably shouldn't say it, but that I was the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen. Then he said that if he were my boyfriend, he'd be kicking himself for falling sick, when he could have been spending time with me instead. It was such a simple thing to say, but it cracked something open inside me. I couldn't remember the last time Damon had called me beautiful. I couldn't even remember the last time he'd really looked at me. Hearing it from Zane made my throat feel tight. I wanted to say something, to make a joke or brush it off, but I couldn't, and before I knew it, we were already leaning in. I knew I should have stopped it, and I should have pulled away before it went too far. But I couldn't. His lips brushed mine and melted into it like I'd been holding my breath for years. When we finally pulled back, I expected the guilt to come crashing in. I expected panic, regret, something, but there was nothing. No shame, no horror. Just this warm, dizzy calm spreading through me. Maybe it was the alcohol. Maybe it was everything that had been building up for years. But in that moment, I couldn't bring myself to feel bad for something that felt so good. And instead of shoving him back or running away, I asked him if he wanted to go for a walk on the beach with me. He hesitated for half a second before saying yes. The air was warm and the sound of the waves was soft against the sand. As we walked, I realized I hadn't taken a single photo since we'd arrived. Not one. For someone who worked in social media, that was basically a sin. My personal page was part of my portfolio, and a place like that was content heaven. It would have been a waste to go there and not take advantage. So I stopped and told Zane I needed to fix that. I asked if he'd take some pictures of me by the water. He grinned and agreed instantly, grabbing my phone like it was no big deal. His eagerness was such a sharp contrast to Damon, who always acted like doing anything for me when it came to social media was a burden. Zane crouched, moved around to find angles, told me where to stand. All the things Damon would never do. He made me laugh between shots, and the photos turned out better than anything I could have hoped for. It was like someone had finally seen me the way I wanted to be seen. He took pictures of me, of the waves, even the resort glowing in the night. Eventually, he switched to video. I didn't even notice at first. I was watching the waves cover my feet when I realized he was filming. He turned the camera on himself for a moment, laughing, and when I reached out to take the phone back, he caught my wrist and pulled me closer. Then he kissed me again. It was messier this time and more than a little clumsy, but it felt good. In that moment, I forgot about Damon, forgot about my job. I forgot about everything except the way Zane's hands felt on my skin. When he invited me to his place, I knew I should have said no. Not only was it betraying Damon, it was also reckless and unsafe. I still barely knew him, but I was blinded by the feeling he gave me, and I didn't say no. We had the whole walk along the beach and a short ride on his motorcycle for me to change my mind, and I didn't. His place was small and tucked away behind the resort, a kind of studio apartment with a view of the water. He kissed me again before the door even closed. We had sex that night, and it would have been easier if it had been bad, if it had been awkward or quick or even disappointing, but it wasn't. It was everything I hadn't realized I'd been missing, all the attention and the feeling of being wanted. When I finally slipped out and snuck my way back into my room, my clothes still smelt faintly like him, and I was grateful that Damon was asleep. He didn't stir or wake up when I crawled into bed beside him, with my heart still racing. The guilt came the next morning. It sat somewhere at the edge of my mind, and I knew that I'd done something irreversible. But even then, it didn't drown out the excitement I felt thinking about Zane. I wanted to see him again, even though I knew I shouldn't. But fate, or karma maybe, had other plans. Because that morning, Damon finally decided that work could wait. He had breakfast with me, smiling like everything was perfect, and told me that from now until the end of the trip, it was just us. No laptop, no phone, no work, just time together. I should have been happy. It was all I'd been asking for. But when he said it, all I could do was force a smile and nod. The timing couldn't have been worse. We spent the day together, doing the activities we'd missed before. It should have been fun, some of it even was, but I was also miserable. It was what I thought I wanted, and yet all I could think about was Zane. Every time I caught a glimpse of him around the resort, teaching a class or walking past the pool, my chest felt tight. He saw me too, but he didn't come over. He kept his distance because he saw that Damon was with me. The last few days dragged on like that. Damon and I went through the motions, and I pretended to be present, but everything between us felt hollow. Every laugh felt forced, every smile heavy. The worst part was that Damon didn't notice a thing. When it was finally time to leave, the sadness that settled in wasn't for the end of the trip. It was for Zane, for the intense connection that didn't have a chance at being anything real. Damon held my hand on the flight home, blissfully unaware and convinced that he'd done something meaningful by reconnecting. I didn't have the energy to tell him any different. All I could think about was him, our night together, and the sharp ache of knowing I'd never see him again. We got home and time passed. Eventually, life just settled, and the ache I'd been carrying from Zane began to dull and fade. Days passed, and the space between Damon and I started to really close a little. Maybe it was time or the guilt I sometimes felt. Whatever it was, it worked. Damon started coming home earlier than usual. At first, I thought it was a fluke. He'd say something like, "Meetings wrapped up faster than I expected," or "I figured I could finish that report tomorrow." The first time it happened, I didn't even bother to hide my surprise. The second time, I waited for the other shoe to drop. By the third, I started to hope again. He wasn't just coming home early, though. It felt like was also present again. He'd ask how my day was, help with dinner, and even suggest movie nights like we used to have years ago. I was wary, expecting it to vanish as quickly as it came. But then a week passed, and he was still doing it. A full week. No late nights at the office and zoning out in front of his laptop while pretending to listen. It made me wonder if the trip had done something, if maybe those stupid forced couples activities I'd barely paid attention to had actually worked. Maybe they'd made him see what he had, or they'd reminded him what mattered. I didn't know, and I didn't care, because for the first time in a long time, I had my boyfriend back. The apartment felt warm again and less quiet. He started to look at me the way he used to, and somewhere in that familiarity, I found myself falling back into him. The closer we got, the more I started to realize that what I'd felt for Zane wasn't love or fate or any of the bullshit I'd tried to romanticize it into. It was just loneliness, plain and simple. Zane had been kind to me when I needed it most. He'd filled a void that Damon had left open. That didn't make it right, but it made it understandable. And the more Damon showed up, the clearer it became that whatever I thought I had with Zane had been delusion and alcohol. The kind of thing that only exists in the moment and disappears once the lights come back on. Damon, on the other hand, he was real. So was our life together. It didn't make sense to throw that away for something that only existed because I'd been too sad to think straight. The guilt that had been eating me alive began to fade. Not disappear completely, but soften enough that I didn't feel bad every day. I started to tell myself that maybe this was the universe's way of giving us a second chance, and maybe it was our turning point. I clung to that thought like a lifeline. I even started to believe it. I told myself that if I kept being good and if I focused on us, on our future, then I could bury the past deep enough. One day we'd get married and it would all just be something I never mentioned again. But I was just naive. The past never disappears. It just waits until you least expect it to crawl its way back out. It happened on an ordinary night. We'd just finished dinner. Damon had cooked and we were sitting on the couch, half watching something on TV. For the first time in our history, I was the one busy. He turned to me casually and asked, "Hey, I completely forgot to ask before. Did you take any pictures during the trip?" I didn't think anything of it. I was halfway through scheduling a post to go up in the morning, my mind buried in captions and analytics. Without looking up, I said, "Yeah, a few, mostly just the beach and stuff." He smiled, held out his hand, and asked if he could see. I passed him my phone without thinking, still typing away. I didn't even stop to think. Why would I? Damon wasn't the snooping type, and I never got Zane's number, so it wasn't like there was anything that could incriminate me, or at least that's what I thought. He scrolled quietly beside me, saying nothing. After a minute, he handed it back, and his expression unreadable. He didn't say anything as he stood up and left. I remember thinking how strange it was that he didn't even show me which ones he liked like he usually did. But then I brushed it off and went back to work, telling myself he was just tired. The next morning, I got pretty late and was surprised to see Damon hadn't left for work yet. He was drinking coffee in the kitchen, just staring into the sink. I made myself a cup while checking my messages. There was one from my boss, marked urgent. It said there'd be an in-person meeting at the office that morning about one of the brand accounts I managed. That wasn't unusual. Sometimes they wanted to discuss changes in content direction face-to-face. By the time I got ready, the post I'd scheduled the night before had been up for a while. I figured I'd check engagement after the meeting and start replying to comments once I'd finished up there. When I got to the office, though, I could instantly tell something was off. People stared and whispered. I tried to ignore it because I thought I was being paranoid. But when I walked into the conference room and saw HR sitting there, along with my boss, the head of PR, and some other execs, I knew something was definitely wrong. My boss told me to have a seat, and my stomach immediately tightened. She tapped a few things on her iPad and asked, "Can you tell us about the post that went up this morning?" I frowned because I was confused, but I spoke anyway. "Sure, it's part of the new engagement push for the makeup brand. I scheduled it last night. I was planning to respond to comments after this meeting." She turned the screen toward me. It was a screen recording of the brand's Instagram page, and I could see already that the latest post definitely wasn't the post I'd scheduled. My heart sank. "Go ahead and play it," she said quietly, so I did. It started with laughter, and I instantly recognized it as mine and Zane's. Then I heard his voice. The camera shook slightly as it pointed to me on the beach. Then it flipped, and soon came the moment where he pulled me to him and kissed me. I couldn't breathe. The room felt like it was tilting. "We made a screen recording before taking it down," my boss said. "It was live for almost an hour before anyone on the team noticed. We understand this must have been an accident, but it's very serious." She went on about how it reflected poorly on both me and the company. I could barely hear her over the rush of blood in my ears. A mistake, one I knew I didn't make. I sat there while they talked and explained company policy, reputation management, and the need to part ways immediately. But all I could think was how. How had that video ended up on the page? I'd specifically scheduled a promotional makeup tutorial. It wasn't until I was walking out of the building, carrying the small contents of my desk in a box, that it hit me. I realized that not only had I forgotten the video even existed, Damon must have seen it when I'd handed him my phone when he looked at the photos. He'd seen everything. And somehow, he'd posted it. Not just anywhere, but on the brand account. He must have done it while I was asleep. There was no other way. By the time the realization settled, I was already in my car. I was fumbling with my keys and shaking so hard I could barely breathe. I drove home on autopilot, and my thoughts were a blur of disbelief, panic, and anger. When I reached the hallway of our apartment, my heart sank once again. My suitcase and a few boxes of my things were scattered by the door. I dropped everything and tried to go inside, but the door wouldn't open. I turned the key over and over again until I realized that Damon must have done something to the locks. So I started banging on the door and begging him to open it. No answer. "Please," I begged. "I know you're in there. We can talk about this. It didn't mean anything. Please, just let me explain." The door finally opened, but just enough for me to see a portion of his face. He looked calm like he always did, like he was unaffected by him getting me fired and tossing all my things outside. "There's nothing to explain," he said. "You made your choices." "It was a mistake," I said with tears burning in my eyes. "It wasn't anything serious. Damon, I was just lonely." I begged him and told him that I loved him. He shook his head slowly. "I don't think you do. And if you did and still slept with someone else, that's even worse." Before he slammed the door in my face, he told me that he wanted nothing to do with me and that I should leave. I stood there frozen before sinking to the floor as I cried. I called his name and pounded on the door again, but he didn't answer. I don't know how long I stayed there before one of the neighbors opened his door and told me that would call the police if we didn't sort out whatever was going on. I spent that night at a friend's apartment, and I barely spoke when they asked me what was wrong. I was scrolling through Instagram to message Damon since he'd blocked me everywhere else when I finally saw it. Damon hadn't just posted the video on the brand page. He'd also uploaded it to his account, with a caption that tore me apart. And then, the final blow, I saw that he'd also posted it on my own account too. I deleted it within minutes, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. By the next morning, my name was trending in circles I didn't even know existed. When I went back to the apartment, hoping to at least grab the rest of my things, the locks had already been changed, and Damon wasn't even there. I sat in my car and sobbed until I felt weak. Everything, my relationship, my career, and my reputation, was gone. I never thought Damon could be that cruel or vindictive. But maybe I shouldn't have been surprised. I'd spent so long trying to convince him to put me before his work, and in the end, I'd proven exactly why he shouldn't have. It's been days since everything blew up, and somehow it still feels like it's getting worse. The comments haven't stopped on his post. There are all these strangers dissecting my life, calling me names, and saying I deserved everything that happened. I used to think my life wasn't perfect before, but now it feels like it's in ruins, and I don't know how I'll ever put the pieces back together again.